Good morning. Thank you all for having me. Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Gil, and for the invitation. So yes, I'm coming from Washington, D.C., from the United States, to give you my thoughts on our experiences and how they're relevant for your lives. I'm going to give you a very quick summary. You know, the story is, in America, we're a lot like you, we're just not as nice. And, you know, that is a little bit of a joke, but it really, I think, is true in that our meanness in some ways is a precursor, an indication of what might be coming for you, because it's not like employers here love unions. You have a little bit of a different setup that's made things a little more restrained. And so I think some of the lessons that I'm going to talk about are really directly relevant, and even some of the things I'm going to describe have already started to happen in Canada. So let's start with some real basics. You probably know much of this, but I think it's worth going over. The US and the Canadian labor systems are very similar. In fact, your laws were modeled on our laws about 75 years ago. The rest of the world has very different kind of systems. They tend to have organizing based on broad industries or what have you, whereas the US and Canada, we focus on organizing an individual employer and then bargaining at that level. In Canada, you have a lot more flexibility at the province level. In the US, we have less so, but generally we have the same kind of setup. The other core similarity between our two countries on unions is that they've been in decline, sharper in the US, but also in decline in Canada. And you can see that especially in the private sector. In fact, that's really where our stories are most similar. So in the United States, for example, in 1980, union member density was around 20% in the private sector. Today, it's 6% in the private sector. That is the lowest it's ever been since we passed laws allowing workers to organize. In Canada, by contrast, you in early 1980s were about 34, let's see, 30%. You're down to 16%. Now, that's not as bad, but the decline, 20 percentage points, is the same. In the public sector, stories are relatively similar, although you're better off. But in the US, until very recently, public sector density has been around a third, and it's been steady for 30, 40 years. Canada, you've largely been around 70, 80% and steady in the public sector. And in Alberta, in particular, you're probably the most like the US, where in the early 1980s, your density was around 20%, exact same. And this is in the private sector, 20%, exact same. Today, you're down in the private sector to 11%. Public sector has been pretty steady and enabled you to overall union density to be okay. But the private sector is kind of the warning sign. And so that's kind of been the story for the past 30 or 40 years, has been this decline, in large part because of what Gil was describing, this sort of neoliberal Washington consensus that held a lot of things. Tax cuts for the rich are good. Unions are bad, among other things. And so we've been fighting this kind of war. I guess it certainly could be a war, but it was relatively subtle, where we're fighting over smaller things, changes in particular rules, how aggressive employers would be. But now I think there's been a big shift, especially in the United States. But before I get to that shift, I want to talk about, so what are the reasons for this decline that I've described? This neoliberal agenda, I think, is a big, big piece of it. Some people will say it's the changing economy or globalization or faster growth in non-union sectors. But I really think this neoliberal agenda, and especially what's behind it, and what's behind it has been employer opposition to unions and to anything that gets in the way of their money and their power. And you can see that what they've done at the workplace. Employers, they're fighting at the individual workplace level has become more aggressive, especially in the United States, more likely to call in anti-union consultants, more likely to fire workers, for example, to go further and break the law. And also, what employers are willing to do in the political space, the kind of policies they're willing to advance to make it harder to unionize. And that's sort of been roughly the picture for 30 or 40 years in the US, and I think even in Canada too. In fact, you had recent changes at the federal level that, for example, got rid of your card check or automatic sign-up for federal employees. We've had those kind of fights at the US level for quite some time. In fact, we don't really have that. We're trying to get it, but now, and quite recently, the corporate class is really smelling blood, and they are trying to kill unions. It's not an exaggeration when I'm going to describe all the things that are happening. It's really they see unions as weak, and they are trying to just about eliminate them in the United States. That might seem extreme for where you are in Canada and what things you're facing. You have some optimistic moments now with relatively supportive people in charge of the whole government in Canada, and especially here in Alberta. But I think it can be taken as a warning sign, and you can listen and sort of hear what's happened in the US. So most of the attacks have started at the state level. You're probably familiar with Wisconsin and Governor Scott Walker. Yes, so you know the basic story, but let me give you a little bit more background and sort of what's really happened behind that. You probably know, you might not know, Wisconsin, before Scott Walker, was actually relatively pro-union state, relatively strong unions by the US standards. In fact, Wisconsin was the first state to give public sector workers the right to organize. The density in unions was higher than in the average in the US. But this sort of story, so in fact, Wisconsin's kind of like Alberta. Public sector in the early 1980s, private sector in Wisconsin was like Alberta, 20% in the 1980s. Public sector, actually quite high for the US, about 45%. The past 3 decades been decline in the private sector, so much so that by 2011, 7% density in the private sector in Wisconsin. Public sector actually been an increase. So the public sector is looking more and more dissimilar from what everyone else is facing. In fact, that was the point of one of the comments earlier, that the public sector, seems like you've got a pension or you've got anything good, that's different than what everyone else has, and, well, might have to lower those public sector worker standards. So that's exactly what happened. As you know, in 2011, Scott Walker came after unions, public sector unions. He claimed that there was a budget crisis, and this is what needed to be done. All states, in fact, were having a budget crisis because a couple years earlier, the U.S. had a financial crisis that had caused great harm to our economy and also to the ability of taxpayers to pay, and it's caused states and other governments to have to spend more on social services. So there was this crisis that had nothing to do with public sector workers, but Scott Walker chose this opportunity to go after public sector workers. And unions were vulnerable because 7% in the private sector, very little strength. Public sector workers seemed very different. So this was an opportunity. And he went after him, and I want to tell you a little bit what was in this bill. You might have heard of it and you say, okay, I sort of know, but I think until you really know how much it tried to weaken unions in all the different ways, it's sort of surprising. So you might know it reduced the ability of some, it eliminated actually for some public sector workers, they no longer had any collective bargaining rights. Hospital workers, university employees, no collective bargaining rights for those people. For most public sector employees, it dramatically limited their bargaining rights. For example, could no longer bargain over benefits, could only bargain over wages, and in fact could only bargain over wages up to inflation. Yeah, brutal. But that's not all. So that's just the part you probably heard about. You haven't even heard of some of these really crazy things that are in there. So let's see. Every year you have to take a vote to stay part of the union, but there's no comparable process if you're a non-union member to join a union. Also, the state payroll deduction would no longer happen. You have to go and collect individual checks or cash from workers instead of having it automatically taken out of the payroll. Also, workers don't have to join a union or even pay fees to get benefits. They can free ride, so even less of an incentive to join. The union can't even bargain for anything, and whatever they bargain for, I don't have to pay for, so I'm not going to. Now, as you can imagine, this effect has been dramatic. In just 5 years, the share of the workforce, public sector workforce that's unionized has been cut in half. That's probably an understatement because there were years of lawsuits and there were some contracts that took some time to unwind. But cut in half in just a couple of years. Since Scott Walker did it, 15 other US states have restricted public sector bargaining. So, that's extreme and far-fetched, but listen to some other attacks, and they're going to sound a little more familiar. Prevailing wage. This is in the U.S. where we have, I'm sure when government spends money on things like construction, that we pay market wages or prevailing wages, which is often the union wage, and that's especially important in construction. These laws we've had for 100 years. I think, let's see, how many? 9 states since 2011 have gotten rid of these. As you probably know, Canada, fair wage, which is similar policy, that was repealed at the federal level just a couple years ago. Restricting union activity. So lots of states have gone after that. You've had opponents trying to push for increased disclosure of union political spending. We've had that for decades. What's happened very recently, 10 states have put additional restrictions, and some of the craziest restrictions, Arizona and Missouri, for example, require a union to predict in advance at the beginning of the year how much it's going to spend on political activity. If it spends more, for example, because, a governor goes after basic bargaining rights, there's huge fines. Alternatively, if a union then says, okay, we're going to spend a lot of money on political activities, but then they don't spend it, that money can't be used for other activities, just walled off. You had to charge extra dues and didn't get to do anything for it. About 7 other states have prevented any payroll deductions for dues. Of course, those same states are very comfortable giving payroll deduction for insurance and other companies that also are political actors that spend political money and don't have any checks on those political spending. So, and then there's right to work, which I know you all are quite familiar with and has been sort of the most traditional part of this fight. But in the US, so right to work, as you might know, so-called right to work, it allows workers to free ride on any sort of bargain that unions are able to negotiate. It's akin to, I think you have the RAND formula, and if you were to get rid of that, which I know some of your opponents that you talked about trying to do. So up until recently, nothing had happened on so-called right to work. We prepared for it, but kind of only in the 1950s and 60s, a bunch of southern states in the US had passed these laws to prevent any sort of racial and economic justice of blacks and whites coming together for union rights and as well as broader sets of rights. So they had passed these decades before and nothing had happened really. Now, bunch more states have passed it. In fact, the majority of US states are right to work. And in fact, now in Congress, US National Congress, we have a national right to work bill that the Republicans have introduced in control, and Donald Trump has said, I love right to work. Shame. Yeah, shame. It is a shame, but it gets worse. We also have a Supreme Court, new conservative nominee, where the Supreme Court is poised to make right to work the law of the land. We also have another bill that a majority of Republicans have co-sponsored in the past. It hasn't been introduced yet this year, but it will be, that has a bunch of really bad provisions. One, you have a sense of, let me just figure it out here, where we go. Oh yeah, it changes the definition of majority. So when you're trying to get workers to join a union, used to be in our elections, if someone didn't vote, they weren't counted. They would count non-voters as voting against a union. So think of how if your national elections or any of your elections would happen separate from unions. In the US, I couldn't find a single member of Congress who had achieved a majority by this standard. Of course, the same bill requires recertification of a union every year, and they go to the old standard, the regular standard for that, because they wouldn't want no voters to be counted as supporting a union in that case. And Donald Trump just yesterday announced a short list of people he was going to put on his labor board. One of the people he considered is being considered is a union avoidance consultant, which in the U.S., yeah, we're anti-union. A lot of people are there, but this would be unprecedented. We've had corporate side lawyers. We've never had an anti-union consultant on the labor board. So this is bad. This is really bad. And why does it matter? Why does it, what's the implication? And this is especially, I think, why Gil wanted me to talk to you. So I think this has profound implications for society. So first, being able to join together in a union and bargain collectively is a basic human right. It's on par with the right to vote. And it's not just me saying that. This is enshrined in things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are long-standing beliefs that these are core rights. But unions also play a critical role in making the economy, in humans' lives better, and in making the economy and democracy work. So the first way that you all are familiar is when you come together, you can negotiate on more relatively even footing with your employer, and that enables you to get higher wages and benefits, which is good for you, but also when you have some density, those gains spill over to non-union workers because their employers tend to raise their wages. Unions also help ordinary people participate in the political process, more likely to vote, more likely to volunteer, more likely to give to charity. So that means that the political system is more responsive to what ordinary people want, what unions want. And that tends to lead to a whole bunch of good things. So societies that have stronger unions have lower economic inequality. The share of income going to the top 1% is lower. The share of income going to the middle and the bottom is much higher. Wages and benefits are higher. Economic mobility, the ability of a child born of ordinary low income or low education parents to get ahead is much greater. Even people's individual well-being or society's well-being, people have better health outcomes. They're happier just in living in a society with stronger unions because of all of the good things you do, the kinds of legislation that's passed, more money on education, for example, higher minimum wage, for example. And that's what you do sort of most directly, but also indirectly by creating this middle-class environment, you make democracy and the economy work in some other ways as well that I think are important to highlight. So some of these have been actually talked a little bit about before and highlighted in some of the comments. So the most basic way is that to help you boost consumer demand, which helps the economy because people have money in their pockets to spend, which leads businesses to want to invest in new products and factories. They're not going to just invest if all the money is at the top because that's the theory that the conservatives use, and they say that's why you need to cut taxes on the rich, that they're going to invest. But the reality is they invest when there's consumer demand there, and consumer demand comes from the strong middle class, which comes from unions. You also have, in strong middle class societies, greater levels of trust between people. Trust means you can work together and do business with each other and negotiate and work together with people you don't know. That's because as inequality pulls people apart, you feel you have less in common and share less interests with them. But when you're together, you can do lots of good things. The strong middle-class societies also develop the human capital of people more. You have better educational outcomes. People score higher on tests. They also go to college and beyond at higher rates. You also, as I mentioned, better health outcomes, but also even have more entrepreneurs in strong middle-class societies. People have the ability to start businesses on their own because they have a little bit of capital to start them, which is necessary because the banks aren't going to lend people to start their business very often. And perhaps most critically, a strong middle class is the foundation of a functioning democracy. it enables and ensures that government is responsive to ordinary people, not just those at the tops, and therefore is going to be stable, which sort of, I think, gets to some of these implications. So what does all this mean, these broad theories and this fight in the U.S., what does this mean for you all and for your future? What I think, you can look at the United States and see some of the really bad outcomes we've had. We've had stagnant wages for 40 years. As unions have declined, wages, that means the typical worker, as the economy has gotten more productive, in fact, the size of our economy has roughly doubled over this period, their wages have gone nowhere. Costs of healthcare, higher education, housing have gone up very fast. Wages have gone nowhere. Same time, inequality in the U.S. is near record levels. Record in our history, but also much higher than most any other advanced industrial society. So Canada, of course, you're a bit better and a bit nicer here, but it's not that different. Inequality, the top share of income going to the top 1%, is as highest it's been now since roughly the 1940s. And also in Canada, you've been fortunate enough to hold out against the worst of the political trends that have brought people like Donald Trump to power. But if inequality continues to rise and the underlying economic conditions aren't good, the public lashes out, and they lash out in unpredictable ways. Donald Trump gave people a scapegoat, minorities and immigrants. You've seen it in most of the rest of the world. In Europe, most countries there, it's the EU and immigrants that are the scapegoats, and certainly could happen here too. But second, in addition to the sort of political context, I think probably most direct relevance for you all is when unions, your employers still want to fight you and defeat you, and if unions are weak, they will come after you, and they can come after you, and they can succeed. And the weaker you are, the less they need these broad kinds of arguments that they've been using before that cover, where they have some cover for the rationale of what they're doing. They can be bold and brazen and directly come after fundamental rights. So that means, and I think the lesson for you all is you need to build and maintain power. You need to grow your membership. And how do you do that? Of course, and it fundamentally starts with organizing in the workplace. That is the essence of the labor movement, of having workers joining together and being able to fight. And so going out and organizing new workplaces, that's the essence. But I think that's only a start, because it also really means you need to build grassroots political power. So that, and you're fortunate you've got a start here in Alberta. You can't just rely on politicians. If you elect politicians, they have to be forced to do what they need to do, and they have to have a rationale to do it and the support to do it. So in the United States, not so long ago, we were very optimistic, in fact. We just elected Barack Obama, who was a community organizer. And we had high hopes that we were going to get labor law and a whole bunch of other reforms. Now, he was in many ways a very, very good president, but he did not do much, if anything, for labor until very, very late. And what he did was immediately overturned, and it's really been sort of heartbreaking for me after having worked for so long on all these very, very modest changes we got, and some of them were very modest. Let me just tell you how modest one of the changes was that we got, where we ensured that government contractors actually had to comply with the law before they got new government contracts. That means they couldn't have just not paid their workforce before they got a new contract. Well, that's gone. And that was how modest of successes we were able to get under Barack Obama. So you need to build a much broader base of support there, and you can work with the politicians and secure any tweaks you can get, because they are important. They are important to staving off decline and important to creating growth. But I think you need to also think of the vision, what you're fighting for, and the kinds of policy changes you want to be as big, as bold as if possible, because fighting for scraps should not be the goal. It really should not be the goal. And that's been where we've been in the United States, and I think you've been largely in Canada too, is fighting, well, just to hang on to what we used to have. And as you've gotten weaker and weaker, that's harder, and it's not enough. It's not enough. I think you want to think about things that would, for example, allow you to double union membership, not just get scrapped back to where you were a couple years ago, and maybe double membership, increase wages for all workers in Alberta. Those should be the goals. And so how you get there, as I said, I think it's the only way to get there is to build a powerful movement, and that needs to be the goal, and that's your challenge. And I'm really thrilled that you've made some of the first steps towards there. It's really heartwarming to come from such a depressing environment where I am to start. But I think, as you all know, your effort is a long road. It is not just this one government at this one moment, and they might be able to change some bills and improve your condition a little bit, but it starts with your organizing on the ground in workplaces and in the broader grassroots to build power that can sustain you through the years so that you can really grow and really create the kind of conditions for workers and all of society to thrive. So, thank you.